Welcome to Shul.com. We are learning from Landlord, Tenant, and Halacha about residential tenants, and we are discussing from page 38 defining the duration of a lease agreement. This is a book by Rabbi Baruch Meir Levine. Very easy, simple, understanding way to learn the halachot and to just be aware of some of the things if you are a residential landlord or a tenant. So let's begin defining the duration of a lease agreement. When a landlord and a tenant enter into a lease agreement, they usually stipulate the duration of time that the lease agreement will be in effect. When such a duration is stipulated, even if only orally, this duration becomes the halachically defined duration of the agreement, and both parties become bound to the lease with all its terms until the end of this duration. If they do not stipulate such a duration, the de facto duration will generally be the minimum duration that a tenant and landlord would normally agree to rent such an apartment in that locale. For a standard non-furnished apartment, this will generally be 1 year. For a summer bungalow, this duration will likely be 1 or 2 months. Now here's the example. A playgroup Mora wished to rent a certain basement for her playgroup. She and the landlord came to an agreement to rent it for $500 per month starting September 1st. But they failed to mention the duration of the lease. Since the standard duration for such a rental would be through June of that year, neither the Mora nor the landlord may terminate the lease before that time. If there is no such standard minimum, the de facto duration would generally be the duration of the first payment period. For example, if the rent was set at $1,000 per month, the duration of the agreement will be 1 month, so like a month-to-month lease. If the rent was set at $250 per week, the duration of the agreement will be 1 week. Once the original lease expires. Once the duration of the initial lease is up, the lease does not automatically renew for the same duration unless the contract called for an automatic renewal. Rather, the lease agreement remains in effect without any specific duration, albeit with all the other original terms and conditions of the original agreement, unless the parties into a new lease agreement. However, there will still be restrictions on when the landlord or tenant may terminate the lease, as will be outlined in chapters 7 and 8. We'll get to that later on. Extending the lease. If during the initial duration of the lease, the tenant and landlord agree to extend the lease for another period of time, and they sign a document attesting to this, the lease becomes extended for that period of time. However, if they only orally agree to extend the lease, and according to some poskim, the parties are not bound to the agreement until the extension period actually begins. Other poskim maintain that the extension is binding. As a matter of practical halacha, because this matter is subject to a dispute, a Beit Din would likely not require the tenant to vacate the apartment before the end of such an extension. On the other hand, if the tenant wishes to vacate the apartment before the extension, a Beit Din would likely not require the tenant to remain in the apartment, or at least pay the rent throughout the extension period, in deference to the poskim who invalidate such an extension. Interesting. In any event, if the extension goes into effect, it will be subject to the same terms and conditions, including the rental price, as the original lease, unless the parties specifically agreed otherwise. Sometimes the landlord might think, okay, we extended it, it's month to month, I'm charging you more. And so this is why these terms have to be spoken out or written or discussed. Renewal options. Often, at the time of the initial lease agreement, a landlord will grant the tenant the option to choose at the end of the lease to renew, extend the lease for an additional period of time. Such an option is halachically binding, and if the tenant elects to exercise this option, the lease will extend under the same terms and conditions as the original lease, unless the parties specifically agreed otherwise. Ideally, the parties should stipulate the exact rental payment to be paid during the rental period. In the absence of such a stipulation, the general assumption would be that the parties intended for the price to remain the same. Certainly, the landlord would not have the right to raise the rent more than the reasonable and customary amount. This is probably going to be discussed later. He doesn't mention it here, but I'm assuming that in the future he's going to discuss how that works. Likewise, the parties should stipulate the exact duration of the renewal period. In the absence of such a stipulation, the duration of the renewal period will generally be assumed to be the same duration as the original lease. The parties should also stipulate until what point in time the tenant has the right to decide to exercise the option, or if the option automatically goes into effect, unless the tenant notifies the landlord to the contrary. It should be noted that the landlord is only obligated to renew the lease according to the specified duration of the renewal option. For example, if the renewal option was for a 2-year period, but the tenant only wishes to renew the lease for 1 year, the landlord is not obligated to renew the lease unless anti-eviction laws apply as discussed on page 213 in the future. Even if the property gets sold during the lease term, the buyer must allow the tenant to exercise the renewal option if it exists in the lease. Let's say the apartment is not ready in time. If the tenant was assured that the apartment would be available at a certain date and the apartment is in fact not ready for the tenant to move in by this date, or soon after, the tenant may cancel the lease and look for another apartment. If the tenant wishes to keep the lease, according to most poskim, he may reduce the rental payment pro rata to the amount of days the commencement of the lease was delayed. When the apartment is not ready in time, this does not give the tenant the right to extend the lease to make up for the delay in starting the lease. So the delay here, he's saying he can get money back or cancel it, but he can't actually extend it more than what the lease states because of that. He ends there chapter 2. We're going to begin tomorrow chapter 3 on reneging on an agreement to a lease. Let's say someone already said he wants to lease it and then he wants to take his word back. We'll discuss that tomorrow. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.